baptism and the Eucharist, but because my week was pretty full. For those of you that don't know, Vandy had her baby. Clementine will be named at the baptism upcoming. And I also am pleased to announce that Luella Augusta Holt, was born the same day, on All Saints' Day. So we've had a lot of babies in the parish. We give praise to God for that. Given that this is the second baptism of a Winifred in the last 3 weeks, I thought it was appropriate to tell you the story of Saint Winifred. Since we'll be saying the name quite a bit, now the whole church will know what the story was. Some of this is children's earmuffs. I'll try to be polite. But before I get into the details of the story, I love Saint Winifred because she is our saint. She is a saint from the old British church. Before Rome took over the English church, the British church, she actually died 4 years before the British church was overtaken by the Roman church at the Council of Whitby. And so she is an Anglican saint, if there ever was one. I also appreciate that she lives out what I think are charisms of our tradition. As you'll see in the story that I tell, she lives out a familial and monastic vision of the faith, contrary to some of the things we find in Rome, which has a little bit more of a political and a scholastic approach to the faith. And so I really appreciate how St. Winifred embodies the tradition that we try to live out, and we can claim her as our own. All right, so here's the details of her story. She was something like a princess, but certainly a noblewoman, a young noblewoman in the time just before the Saxons took over Wales. So she lived in Wales and was part of the nobility of Wales. And she was either the brother or the niece of Saint Buno. We will talk about Buno. You guys didn't get that. You guys need to be on your toes. We talk about Buno. Still didn't get it. Come on. Thank you, Kara. I can always count on Kara. All right. She was the niece of Saint Buno, who was a notorious figure at the time of all of his works and catechesis of the poor. But she was known, Saint Winifred, for having an enormously gifted mind. She was brilliant. She was beautiful. And she was holy. And everyone in the area knew that she was these things. She, from a young age, inspired by her uncle, Buno, began to prepare for consecration as a nun. Well, one day, as her family was attending Mass, a villain, a kind of a up-and-coming guy from the local village nearest them, heard of her beauty and came to propose. Well, St. Winifred denied Caradoc. Sounds like a villain, Caradoc. And Caradoc would not take no for an answer. And it began to get more and more intense, and St. Winifred refused him more and more intensely. And finally, he became so aggressive in making her his that she ran to the church where her parents were attending Mass. He caught up with her, drew his sword, and cut off her head. The story does not end there. She fell, of course, dead on the ground, and someone ran and told her uncle, St. Buno, who was celebrating Mass just a few hundred feet past where she fell. He left the altar, took off his robes that he was celebrating in, and laid it over the body of his niece, putting her head back near her body. And then the whole church went back into the sanctuary and finished the Mass, petitioning God that they would at least be communing with this beautiful soul that they loved so much in the Eucharist. But God had one better, because after Mass they went back to where she lay, and according to the legend, her head was reattached to her body, and she was alive and well but sleeping. And for the rest of her days had a white line. That was all she had as a memory of that terrible moment. St. Bruno prayed to God that he would take vengeance on his niece, and Caradoc fell dead right then. The other miraculous thing was when the head fell, this is according to the legends, there was a well that sprang up right where the head hit the ground. That's a common theme in what they call hagiography. St. Paul's head, they say, bounced 3 times and 3 springs of water came up each place. I don't know if it's true, but it makes for a good story. But this well actually became known as Holy Well, and was the oldest and is the oldest English place of pilgrimage in England. People have been going to Holy Well for 1,300 years, more than 1,300 years. And so she is the oldest site of pilgrimage in the history of the English tradition. But after she was recapitated, is that a word? It's a word today. She was recapitated. She served as an abbess for a convent of friends who wanted to pursue a life of holiness in that tumultuous time. Let me tell you why I thought it was worth you learning the story of St. Winifred. It wasn't just because we have 2 of them here. St. Winifred grew up in a time of political turmoil and moral debauchery. You know, we take a lot of pride in the fact that there was a church in Britain at the time. Britain was a wreck. It was not a strong church. There was a church, and it was very much not the broad culture of Britain at the time. The fact that Caradoc would have thought that he could get away with his terribly evil actions towards Winifred is an indication of the moral culture of that time. She was a saint when it was not popular to be a saint. She was a saint. She lived a holy life in a culture that was completely different from what she loved and valued in her life. She had opposition. It eventually cost her her head. Thankfully, God restored her. The other thing I think that is important to note is that her answer was not mere seclusion. She was the founder of convents. She did give her life not to family, but to monasticism, but not by herself. She followed the British pattern of gathering in others who desperately wanted to live after God in the midst of paganism, and they formed a community. I wonder if the counterpart to the Hall of Tyrannus might be a third Winifred in this church. The other thing is that she resisted the objectification of her body by her culture. And that has tremendous resonance for where we live today. We have 4 girls, at least, unless I'm forgetting one. We have 4 girls that have been born into this church in the last few months. And I wrote in my vicar's note what I hope for them. I can tell you what I'm, at times, given to fear about. The world around them wants to objectify their bodies. They want to take from them that which only God receives. But St. Winifred resisted even unto death what her culture wanted to do with her body. And she was a scream in the face of paganism that she was a soul, that sex is soulish, and that her virginity was given to God, and if he would call her to marriage. And I hope that that is something that is true of our four mighty women of God who have been born to us in this church. She responded to the times with forming communities of faith out of fidelity to family. She was inspired by her either brother or uncle. And she pursued holiness in the context of friendship. And those are all things that I would like us at Christ the King to live after. Question for you, presented to us by our propers for the day. Was Winifred a soldier? Was she a soldier? She was a soldier. She was militant in her faith, though she does not look like she conquered much. In fact, part of her story is that she was conquered by Caradoc. We have this motif of being a warrior or a soldier not only in our processional hymn, not only in our recessional hymn, but also in our epistle. St. Paul talks to us about putting on the armor of God that we might resist the wiles of the devil, that we might stand firm against the world and the flesh. We are all soldiers, just like St. Winifred was. I think that she is a helpful image of what a soldier should be because she listened to what St. Paul wrote. Her armor was truth, righteousness or holiness, peace, faith, assurance, and she knew the scriptures. This is how she conquered the world, the flesh, and the devil. This is an aspect of our salvation. Why is it important that we can consider ourselves soldiers of the Most High God? That we fight under the banner of Christ our King? Well, it answers something that we feel very real in this time. We sense that there is a conflict between us and the world in this moment, don't we? I sense that. I sense it in myself. I sense that I have a conflict with my flesh. I sense that behind both the world and the flesh, there is an enemy that I do not understand and that I cannot overpower except by the one who claims me as his soldier. It helps us to put our faith in a combative context. Because when we wake up in the morning and we wonder, how am I going to live through this day as a Christian? How is the red blood that God put in my body going to pulse for the gospel today? There are no images that I know of that are more powerful than the image of a soldier. We are called to fight manfully under the banner of Christ. You are a soldier. St. Winifred was a soldier. And so we have these references that come up in the course of their liturgy and of the year. I wanted to point out a few to you. If you turn to page 13, there at the bottom, when we seal with oil the forehead of the one being baptized, there on the fourth line of that prayer, we say that she shall not be ashamed to confess the faith of Christ crucified and manfully to fight under his banner. This is also what's referenced in our processional hymn on verse 2, where it says, each newborn soldier of Christ crucified bears on their brow the seal of him who died. We also reference this every single time an infant is brought forward, both in the womb and out. If they don't receive Holy Communion yet, we bless them in the womb and out. And we say the same thing. We have done it, and I think we'll continue to do it. We say, may God make you into a mighty woman of God in the kingdom. This idea of being a soldier. This idea of being a soldier gives us the image that we are in a kingdom, that our faith is fealty, that our belief is allegiance, that we are not just sinners, we are not just children of God, we are not just the bride of Christ, though we are all of these things. We are not just priests in the priesthood of all believers, not just laborers, but soldiers too, servants of the King. And though we be lambs among wolves, because of the power of the gospel, we are more dangerous than the world and the flesh and the devil. That is my prayer for our Winifreds, that they be more dangerous than the world, the flesh, and the devil, because Christ dwells in them. And so this morning, I ask that we would turn our attention in closing to St. Paul. He closes out this epistle on page 4, asking the church in Ephesus to pray for him, a warrior of God, as he sits in prison with a chain around his neck where Winifred had the band around hers. He says, pray for me, verse 19, that utterance may be given unto me, that I may open my mouth boldly, that I may make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in bonds, that therein I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. And so I ask that when you come forward and you take the Eucharist, that you ask that God would give you whatever gift you need to be made bold in the gospel, to be strong in your enlistment, that whatever injuries you have accrued in the warfare that accosts you, you would be healed and made fit for battle, that you would be like Paul, that you would be like Winifred, that you would conquer the world and the flesh and the devil by the power of Christ which dwells in you.